I can think back on maybe 3 or 4 different events on my own like nutritional journey where I encounter something that's so bizarre. It doesn't even like make sense. Like you read one of Gary Taubes or Nina Teichel's books, and it's like everything you've been told about nutrition is wrong, and it blows your mind. And then you learn that Sean Baker is off eating ribeye steaks and nothing else, and not eating vegetables, and he's crushing it. And then maybe you learn from Sally Norton that oxalates in plants, all of the superfoods that you think are amazing for you, all the sweet potatoes and the chard and the spinach and the almonds could be possibly bad for you. That just like blew my mind at the time. And this is absolutely one of those stories. So Belinda, tell us, how in the world did the Seventh-Day Adventist Church started? I believe it was started by Ellen White. She was the one that was having the visions, at least. Yes. Can you tell us how that whole thing started and how that propagated into today, where they still are influencing our nutritional guidelines on a massive scale that nobody realizes, besides you?
Well, it's not just me. Frederick Leroy and James Connolly, the three of us are sort of looking into this religious space and then that impact and where it's flowing. Frederick Leroy goes right off into a whole lot of other information as well. So, but I think people have underestimated this religious ideology that has impacted our dietary guidelines and the belief. So in 1863, the Seventh-Day Adventist Church was officially incorporated, but it was a break-off group from the Millerites back in 1844. The great disappointment when Jesus didn't return to earth. And there was a guy called Hiram Edson the very next day after Jesus didn't return, and he had a vision in a cornfield that Jesus was moving from his holy place to his most holy place, and then he was starting to write the books of whether we were good or we were bad. He was there creating this new space. So Ellen G. White, a few months later, had a very similar vision back in 1844. And as time went on, she and a group of very, very young Adventists, which is what they call themselves. And so Ellen was 16 or 17 at the time. James White, her husband-to-be, was 23. He was the oldest of the young group. But we're talking about people who are 15, 10, 13. These young people were organizing this religious belief through these visions that Ellen was getting about the next life. And she went on to talk about the fact that the Seventh-Day Adventist Church, which they were part of, were the spiritual children of Israel. And if the original children of Israel had done the commandments that Jesus had asked, Jesus would have come back and the world would have finished. We would have all been up in heaven. So she truly started to take it on herself that she and this group of people were the ones that were going to save everybody and take this message further. And she was told in 1863 to use this health reform visions that she was getting about the importance of the Garden of Eden diet, fruit, nuts and seeds. So that was the original.
Fruit, nuts and seeds, not even vegetables.
Not even vegetables.
So the exclusion of animal meats, and we can talk about that, but not even vegetables. So the whole original Garden of Eden diet was fruits, nuts and seeds.
Yes.
Well, that's interesting too, because I wonder back in the time how many vegetables were even around, and the way that we recognize vegetables in the grocery store today, there may have been a complete difference in availability.
Exactly. And then she went on to have a couple more within a year. I think she was being told by God that meat was carcinogenous. It was dangerous. And meat in 1863, when she was told, it animalized people. It caused people to masturbate and self-vice, which was the term they used back then. And it became about polluting people. So this concept was very, very strongly brought into the church. Interestingly, she didn't actually give up meat until she was in the 1890s, when she came out to Australia, to Sanitarium apparently. So despite the fact that she's propagating this messaging that this is what spiritual people should be eating, and certainly the Seventh-Day Adventist Church were advocating those things, she did talk about eggs and milk and butter as something that we would eventually get rid of. But that's why John Harvey Kellogg was so intent on creating these alternative foods to those things, because they couldn't really get rid of eggs, milk, and butter because of the importance of vitamin B12 and other essential vitamins and minerals that were in these things, and essential protein. So they had to work out a way to create foods that would take that place. And when she came to Australia, she set up Sanitarium here, which was based on John Harvey Kellogg's model at the Seventh-Day Adventist Church's Battle Creek Sanitarium in Michigan. But this time she wanted the church to own it. So Kellogg's was never owned by the church. It was founded and funded by Seventh-Day Adventists, and the church helped fund, but they actually owned Sanitarium here in Australia. And this is where the expert witness that was brought into the APRA Medical Board's case, he was working for Sanitarium.
Wow.
And I suppose that's how I started to connect the dots as to the influence of the Seventh-Day Adventist Church, was purely because of this expert witness. And it made me start to look at Sanitarium. And even though I was vaguely aware growing up that it was owned by a church, you do and you don't. And I guess a lot of people in America would be very similar. You are aware that there's universities and that there's different things owned by the church, but are you aware of how influential those places are in educating people about the demonization of animal proteins and fats? And so I'd gone into it looking for sugar, found low carb, but had not expected that Gary wasn't just in trouble for talking about cereals and sugar and reducing those. He was in, I reckon, just as much trouble for talking about animal proteins and fats, the health benefits of those. And so that just blew my mind.
So go back in time, because that whole concept of meat causes cancer probably wasn't cancer per se. It was probably cancer of the soul.
Yeah.
So that whole early belief of meat causes cancer, meat causes violence, meat causes masturbation, is actually all what
spiritual, moral defilement.
Yeah, and so, but tell the link between why John Harvey Kellogg then became obsessed with trying to sort that out.
Yeah, well, he was 12 years old when he went to work for the Seventh-Day Adventist Church's
first
founding family, James and Ellen White. And he was in charge of typesetting for them. That's how he was going to earn some money, because his father was such a devout Seventh-Day Adventist that he believed the end of the world was so soon that he decided his children didn't need educating.
Well, I learned that today from listening to some of your material. I had no idea. That right there tells you how strong their beliefs were. Wow.
How strong their beliefs were that the world was going to end if they could just let enough people know. And so John Harvey Kellogg was 12. And if you look at a 12-year-old, how impressionable are 12-year-olds in their environment, in what they're learning? Like, they're just drinking it all up. And I think that must have been an incredible time for him to be immersed in that area for 4 years.
But he was typesetting her first book.
Yeah, okay, to that.
Oh, okay.
So typesetting her first book, which was a solemn appeal to mothers. And this book spoke only of deterring your children from masturbating. So in every sort of way, it was everything from, put them on a hard floor. She and John Harvey Kellogg actually worked out how to create genital cages to stop children touching themselves. Like, it went further and further. But
oh my goodness.
Meat, do not put meat on the table of your child, because this will stimulate them to have self-vice. And so she also put into this book all the terrible things that were going to happen to children should they eat meat and masturbate. And so we've all heard of masturbation causes loss of vision. I think it still sort of perpetuates vaguely around life even now. I've heard that when I was growing up. So that's sitting there. But she talked about that it would decay heads, and it was as if you'd put a pistol to your own chest and killed yourself. He was 12 to 16 listening to this messaging of how terrible meat was, morally, spiritually, and physically. He was immersed in that. And I often say, is it any wonder that when he became a medical doctor, which James and Ellen White actually paid for him to study medicine and become the superintendent of the Western Health Reform Institute, and which he then changed the name to Battle Creek Sanitarium. So he became the head of that. Is it any wonder, though, that he was so intent on creating these alternates to meat, milk, and eggs and butter? This was his lifelong quest
Yeah.
to save people.
He was brilliant,
He
though.
was a very smart man.
I mean, he was able to start the Battle Creek Sanitarium, which has become the model for every major hospital in the Western world.
He was the first person to wear white as a doctor.
Wow, I didn't know that. Interesting.
All white,
so
like
that
shoes the whole way.
Multi-level buildings where you bring all the services together
Yes.
into the one environment. That is the modern hospital setting. John Harvey Kellogg, he's clearly misguided, but he was brilliant. He was able to, drag together people, and the great names of that era used to come to Battle Creek Sanitarium for cleansing and their washouts, and literally their washouts.
Yeah.
Before that, the hospitals tended to just have people who were very, very sick, derelict. And if you worked in a hospital, you were at great risk of actually catching a disease and dying yourself. That's where Florence Nightingale was coming in and trying to change conditions in hospitals. So they started the opposite way. They started as a health and wellness retreat with, all the water treatments that he did and enemas. He was just passionate about getting everything out of the colon. So I think this is where, this bland food and this high fiber diets and everything else came from, was this, you just didn't want anything in there that might irritate and stimulate anything down below. So he was a massive fan of colonic enemas.
Wow.
But he did change the concept of the hospital as it grew and grew, because they ended up having 1,200 people were able to attend that hospital at one time.
Wow.
Which was, as Gary said, unheard of. And the concept that doctors had to wear white and then the uniforms for the nurses became very much a part of American hospital procedures.
So interesting. So he invents cornflakes as like this really bland food as the alternative for the meat and the eggs that will boost your testosterone. For how
not boost your testosterone, dampen it.
Yeah, right. And for how scary Ellen White's writings were on certain things, I think he took it a step further. Right? Some of his writings on masturbation itself are really insane. Like, he was in favor of circumcision for adults without painkillers, and not just male, male and female. And you read some of the ways that he would talk about people who did it. It's like a little scary. You're supposed to be cast down to the seventh hell of fire and brimstone or whatever. It's kind of scary.
I had a great chat with James Connolly. Just one sec. I had a great chat with James Connolly last week, and he sort of did a bit of a light bulb moment for me, where they were looking at people who were in insane asylums, and these people were locked up with nothing else to do, and they found that they were masturbating. So they looked at them and said, well, they're masturbating, that's caused their insanity, and that's why they're polluting and making themselves so bad. So if you think back to those days, I went, of course, that starts to make a little bit of sense as to why they thought that caused insanity, whereas potentially those people were locked up and had nothing else to do.
Wow.
Sorry.
That's crazy. We're going to host James here in a few weeks, so I'll be sure to ask him about that for sure. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's a really, really light bulb moment for me with all of the research that I've done. I went, oh, of course, that sort of makes some sense there.